Welcome to Nerdonomic. I'm Paige, and on this channel we give financial advice that's accessible for pragmatic geeks. It's hard enough to get ahead, and the worst part is that once you get ahead, if you're that lucky, the real challenge begins. Have you ever felt like you still don't know what you're doing with your money? Even though you're in a better financial position than you've ever been? You're not alone, and there's a name for it. It's called financial imposter syndrome. And it's something that isn't talked about enough. And in fact, I didn't even know that was a thing until it was happening to me and I was freaking out. And I'm willing to bet that you or someone you know have gone through it. Essentially, financial imposter syndrome is a psychological phenomenon where someone doubts their own financial abilities and accomplishments. And an individual with financial imposter syndrome feels like they don't deserve their own wealth or success, even if they worked very hard to achieve it. And it can also mean fearing exposure or being a massive fraud when it comes to managing money, despite all evidence to the contrary. So what does this look like? Well, I'll share my experience with you and how I first discovered what financial imposter syndrome was and that it even existed. So I recently bought a house. And not only did I recently buy a house, I bought my dream house in a high cost of living area. Yes, in this economy with these interest rates. I'll go more into that in some later videos about how that worked out, how I managed to make those numbers work. But I'll tell you a little secret. I went into the real estate search, the housing search, not expecting to buy my dream house. Once we started looking for a house, we had a budget in mind. We kept kind of going back and forth. At first, my husband was kind of like, let's get a big house, let's get the dream house. But you've seen the real estate market, you've seen the interest rates. We've been thinking about it sort of casually for a couple of years. And when we really started to look actively, it was the summer of 2023. And in some of the areas we were looking at, inventory was low. It was still a seller's market. There were people paying over a price for houses. Bidding wars were erupting and the inventory was not looking good. Things were not staying along on the market. So we had originally thought, oh, we'll get a nice house, we'll get a big house, we'll get the dream house. And it just wasn't feasible. The numbers were just so huge and they scared us and conditions weren't great. So we dialed it back. We're like, well, you know what? We can get a house for now and then maybe 5 or 10 years down the road, once we have some equity and once we can kind of offset the closing costs and all that, we can upgrade at that point and find the forever home. And potentially writing things out, maybe, the housing bubble would burst, maybe the market would soften, maybe rates would get better, you can never tell these things. So we were kind of like, okay, we adjusted our dreams to go from the dream house to the right now house. And then in October of 2024, we finally met up with an agent, we connected with a lender, and we were pre-approved for an amount that sounded huge to us. So that was the first kind of financial imposter syndrome moment. It was like, really? Really? You would lend us that much money? Because our upper budgets were much lower than what they would lend us. Now, to be fair, just because a bank is willing to lend you money, it doesn't mean that that debt will be comfortable to pay off. It doesn't mean you will want to be house poor, car poor, fill in the blank poor. Just because the bank says yes doesn't mean that it'll be comfortable. And we really wanted to comfortably afford something. So we basically decided, well, that's nice that you'll give us this money and everything. It's nice that you're willing to do this. I should say not give us this money, lend us this money. But there's no way we can afford that. Oh my God, there's like a bug in here. What are you doing? What are you doing, buddy? Get out of my studio. There's a bug. Let me show you guys. Check this out. He's like on my Cleveland sticker, which, fun fact, I lived in Cleveland for about 8 years. I'm gonna get this guy outside so we can finish our conversation. Okie doke. Whoops, I'm kicking the tripod. Ooh, okie doke. Anyway, that was the first instance of financial imposter syndrome. So we were pre-approved for this amount. And we sent our realtor a spreadsheet of our preferences. My husband and I are both very meticulous and orderly. So we had spreadsheets. I love spreadsheets. I love spreadsheets. Had all our pros and cons. We sat down with the realtor and there was a house that looked pretty promising in this one neighborhood. Our realtor picked out another house that was 1 minute down the road. It was the nearest thing. It was a bigger house. It cost more money than the other house, the small house, the sensible house. It was kind of a wild card because the listing wasn't very good. It wasn't well marketed. There was no layout. There was no sense of how the property flowed. It had been on the market for a while. But it was like, okay, we'll go see the house that looked like a serious contender, that was the right price, that was right size for right now. And while we're seeing this first house, we can just bop over to the other one and, kind of contrast, get to know our realtor. We really weren't expecting necessarily to like either house. Although to be fair, we had looked at hundreds of listings online. We were very meticulous. So there was probably a better shot than I thought going out. So we meet up with a realtor. We go to house one. I love house one. It was pretty well maintained. It had everything we needed. I guess the ceilings were a little bit low. I am 5'5". My husband is over 6 feet tall, and he had plenty of head clearance, but he noticed it once our realtor pointed it out. We work at home. It hit all the basics. We didn't have anything extra, right? But for my thinking, a bigger house is more to clean, it's more to heat. The low ceilings also mean less to heat and cool. So I was really down with getting a small house because it's less time for me to have to clean and all that. Plus, the price was right. It had only been on the market for like 3-4 days when we saw it, so we knew we would have to jump on it fast. I loved that neighborhood. I loved the neighborhood. It was adorable. This was kind of the small end of houses in this neighborhood. So I was pretty pumped. I was really envisioning myself in this house, imagining myself in this house. I could make it work for 5 years, especially because prior to getting our house, we lived and traveled full-time in an RV for 2 years, which is like 200 square feet. This first house was 1,600 square feet. So huge upgrade for us. Not a terribly big house, but plenty big for me after the RV. I liked the backyard, loved the neighborhood. So we went off to house 2. I was expecting nothing at house 2. Now we rock up to house 2 and we go inside and it is ginormous. House 2 is over 3,000 square feet. The lot's bigger. It is like twice the size of house 1. The flow is excellent. There's actually a vaulted ceiling. There's skylights. It's perfect. I immediately go into, no, because it's too much house, right? I know the price tag. I know it's kind of expensive. I know it's more than the first place. I know it's more to clean, more to heat, all that stuff. But Justin, my husband, falls in love with the house. And I'm basically desperately trying not to fall in love with the house. But I go in the backyard. There's a koi pond. I'm like losing it over these fish. I'm gasping. The backyard is gorgeous at this house. I'm like, okay, whatever. And we have this really heated conversation in the kitchen because we liked both houses. Our realtor's like, well, here's what I'll ask. If you found out there was an offer on one of these houses, which one would you be more disappointed about? And at the same time, I said house 1, Justin said house 2. So yeah, Justin was like, well, I'd like to sleep on it. I tend to be like, I want to know now. I want to have a plan. I was like, we got to figure this out. We got to put an offer in the house. Justin wanted to sleep on it. So go home and I did some research. I did a debt to income ratio. I checked out mortgage rates, tax rates. I looked into interest rate buy downs. I crunched the numbers and I discovered we could afford the dream house. We could afford house 2. And that was even without an interest rate buy down, which we were able to negotiate with the seller, various repairs that they were doing, various offsets. We managed to build a lot of concessions into the deal. The house had had one deal fall through. There had been one buyer who kind of jerked them around and then left the country. And now it was a stale listing. It had been on the market for a while. The seller was very, very kind, very nice. It was a very win-win thing. We were able to structure the deal so we both felt like we won. She helped us out a lot. But we had this feeling when we saw the price of this house, like, that doesn't seem real. Like, we cannot afford a house that costs this much. Now, this is in spite of the fact that we have been working very, very hard. We have both been upwardly mobile in our careers. We've been together over a decade. When I met my husband, he was doing kind of entry-level work. Now he's a senior manager. I have built a successful online business. I have worked online for myself for 7 years in various forms of content creation. I first started out with writing, but last year I broke into video. I have an e-commerce business. I actually, believe it or not, made 6 figures on Facebook randomly out of nowhere. I I actually did another video about that on my other channel, the Paige Turner channel, where I talk about content creation and online business. I will link that video below if you're curious about that. But I had a huge windfall with that, and that helped with down payments, getting rid of debt, and emergency funds. I had that windfall in addition to our income going up. But the wild thing is that I hadn't gotten the memo. Neither of us had. We were still living at the same standard of living that we had back 10 years ago when our situation was different, when we had a lot more debt and when we were making less money. And yes, the numbers were going up. We could see the debt going down, our numbers going up, but for some reason it hadn't emotionally registered, and it felt a lot more precarious than it probably could have, especially because housing has gotten more expensive. This is a high cost of living area and interest rates are ridiculous right now. So it didn't make sense that we could afford it, but we totally can. We've been here for a couple months now and we love it. The big numbers freak me out, but they're not just big numbers going out, big numbers that are big payments going out, they're also big numbers coming in. Anyway, financial imposter syndrome is that kind of disconnect when you are in a different financial bracket than you feel like you belong in. In our case, we both grew up lower class, lower middle class. Justin was in rural Michigan, I was in rural Maine. My dad was a construction worker, my mom was a housewife. She had a bunch of kids. I come from a big family. Jobs don't pay that well in rural Maine. Justin's parents had him really young. They were actually on WIC and assistance for a while. It was very paycheck to paycheck. He only was able to go to college because of scholarships. I have had every menial job under the sun. I used to clean hotel rooms as a maid. I worked retail for years and years. We've both done food service. So for us, that's our background. We are not used to being able to buy a nice house. We are not used to being able to buy a dream house. We did not get the memo. And apparently there were a lot of people like us, people who are upwardly mobile, who experience financial imposter syndrome due to past financial struggles or fear of falling back. It is apparently very, 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 very common. Happens to pretty much everybody who goes through this life path. Okay, so we know it's common, we know what it is. Why does it happen? Okay, so there's a few things going on here. The first is something called survivor's guilt. If you're not familiar with it, it's this guilt you feel for everything and everyone you left behind or for the people who didn't make it. So in a financial sense, that would be feeling guilty because you escaped poverty and other people didn't. This could be people you know. This could be people you don't know, just people from your neighborhood. These could be people you see. Another reason that this happens is because it's easy to compare yourself to other people who are wealthier than you, especially if they're your peers. Justin is guilty of this a lot. He has known some guys that work in tech that signed up with startups at just the right point, and they went from making peanuts to being millionaires overnight. And that is not his path. That is not our path. And so for him, he's kind of like, if I'm not doing that, then I'm not financially secure, I'm not wealthy. When in reality, there are so many different paths to financial health and wealth, and some people are gonna look like this, more like ours, and some people are gonna be like, whoop, and that's okay. It's really easy to not recognize the one that looks like this. If you're wondering if you have financial imposter syndrome, here's a couple ways to recognize the symptoms. One big tell is that you're waiting for the other shoe to drop. You're waiting for the financial rug to be pulled out from underneath you. I was talking to Justin about this. We can afford the house at our current income levels, and we have an emergency fund that we could be very frugal with and skate by for a couple of years if we had to. But what if one of us were unable to work and that persisted for a couple of years? Could we still afford this house? I said to Justin, I trust the present, but I don't trust the future. And I think that's a symptom of that. Now that's a little bit ridiculous, right? Because the traditional financial advice is to have 6 months of bills in reserve. So obviously if you have 2 years, then what are you worried about? But again, it's that feeling, that fear that it'll all go away. I don't trust the future. Another sign is that you're still living as if you're penny pinching and broke, even though you don't have to. This can actually be a really good thing, and I do think that most of the time it helps me to stay grounded and stay frugal. I will say that it really confuses my friends sometimes. I am really neurotic about spending money on myself. I've had to really go through a whole process where I evaluate whether I want to splurge, whether something's worth it. My challenge has less been not spending the money. I didn't really have money to spend. I was really struggling to survive. My struggle is less refraining from spending the money and more not feeling horrifically sick when I do something nice to myself, not feeling guilty, identifying the things I do need. I can err a little bit in that direction. Okay, so we know what it is. We know some of the signs of it. Let's talk about how you can overcome it. So here are a few tips for reframing your mindset. The first is shifting your perspective. So you're allowed to compare, but instead of comparing it to the wealthiest people around you, the people who are instant millionaires, compare it to your past self. That works a treat for me. I can go back and I can think about where I was. I have these vivid memories of my old budget from 20 years ago and the weird hacks that I used. And I can remember my budget, I can remember the sacrifices, I can remember the stress, I can remember all of that. I'm not saying I don't have stress these days. I have stress, although things have improved, but it was a completely different ballgame. That works well for me. Another thing you can do is to acknowledge your hard work. Instead of being like, well, whatever. Recognize the effort and the smart decisions that led you here. Don't skip past that. Don't skip forward on that. Give yourself some credit. Okay, the next one I struggle with, and that's learn to enjoy your success. I am actually working on this, and this is something that I will probably talk more about on this channel, but it is very important if you have been upwardly mobile to allow yourself to celebrate your successes and enjoy those little luxuries. You don't have to go completely hog wild with it. Little things will work. My big treat this week was a couple of bath bombs that I got. I'm telling you, I spent like $3 and it made my week. Anyway, it's been great talking to you as always. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.